Hey guys, welcome back to another installment of LHCyberx Explains It All. And this week we're going to be talking about web components, more specifically the accessibility of web components and how to make sure a website is easily accessible by a user. Now, accessibility in generic terms just means that a website is accessible to users. It's accessible in the widest range possible of users. And I found a couple articles that help discuss accessibility pretty well. And so here's kind of a broad definition of accessibility. They say it's a user experience subset, making your website usable by the widest range of people possible. These are just kind of the 5 categories of accessibility to take into account when you're looking at accessibility of websites. And overall, web components help a lot with accessibility as creates a kind of a shortcut to cut down on the amount of time it takes to write code. If you're writing a lot of common code for a website or multiple different projects and you find yourself having to repeat a lot of it, you can turn this into web components to cut down your time and cut down the amount of resources that you need to complete that. So I'll put all these articles that I'll talk about today in the links below, but as you can see scrolling through this, it tells you a lot of things that you should and shouldn't do when talking about web components and accessibility. So that's just one of the articles that I found very helpful. And then another one was here. So it kind of gives coding examples of what's accessible and what's not. So it gives 3 different ways of a JavaScript line of code that could be written 3 different ways. The first way is, it doesn't work. The second way is, okay, it works, but it's unreliable. And then it shows you the third way, which is the best way. And it says that, by using this bulletproof method, there's less of a chance that your website will become inaccessible, which is what you don't want. Of course, web components can still be inaccessible if they're written in the wrong mindset. People sometimes think that using all these fancy coding techniques and fancy language means that you don't have to make it accessible or readable to the human eye, which is completely false. Writing it in a complex term will only make it harder for the next person to understand, whoever has to maintain it or work on it next. They should always prioritize user experience and accessibility for web components over anything else. And this goes through a bunch of other tags and elements that you should use and you shouldn't use during the accessibility. This is and this third article is the main article that I wanted to talk about in terms of accessibility for web components. Now the first one is a big one. The first one for me is the most important one when dealing with web components and accessibility is code is not just written for computers to understand. When looking at code, a lot of people are scared or timid of the way it looks because a lot of the times it's a computer can understand it, but a person cannot. And that's actually the opposite of what it should be. Especially for web components, it should be accessible to the human eye. It should be easily understood by the human eye. So it's written cleaner, so it has better performance, and of course increased accessibility as people can maintain it and understand it better as well. So here's a bunch of benefits that web components actually provide towards accessibility, and just cutting down the resources, the reusability. You can import and reuse a lot of elements and applications. You can define the scope a little bit better, and of course here accessibility. As you're using existing browser elements that don't need to be rewritten or invented, the accessibility of those default elements comes with it. It provides the user with a much better end experience through those browsers and web components. And also the back end, the people who are actually writing the code and the people who have to maintain it and work with it. And of course, this is kind of overall benefits as well. Web components bring consistency by making sure everything's consistent, using consistent code. You can ensure that your brand is consistent throughout your whole entire company. It also cuts down on resources. If two projects in the company overlap with code, you can use those web components to cut down on resources and time that it takes to create that. And of course, like I just said, it saves you money. It saves companies money by reducing the time it takes them to maintain code, rewrite code, write new code for a website. And in terms of developer experience, makes the project more efficient, makes it more accessible. The code is now easier to understand, easier to consume for these developers that have to work with it every day. As a byproduct, it's easily accessible. They can read it, they can understand it, which means they can better maintain it. Overall, those are just some pretty important benefits and accessibility notes about web components. Now, the best one is, I believe that this first one is really important. Making it accessible for people to understand, easily readable, easily consumable. I believe that that's one of the most important parts. And I'll throw all these links to accessibility and web components down in the description below. But that's it for this week's installment on web components and accessibility, and hope to see you here back next week.